Today I'm going to be talking to you about something that relates to all of us. It's something that I have people ask me about all the time. Today I'd like to talk to you about the will of God and how to know what God's will is for your life, because that's typically the context that I get asked about it. Pastor, how do I know what God's will is for me or for my business, or what God's will is for me in this next season of where I should move, or what school I should put my kid into? And the will of God, sometimes we don't always understand all of it in all of its fullness. There's some mystery to it. But I do believe that sometimes we make it too mystical. We make it too untouchable. Like we could never understand it. We could never get close to it. And that's not what the Bible has to say. And the verses I'm about to read in Romans that we're just going through 2 verses today, will clearly tell us that we can, if we live in the right way, understand, let me be clear, understand the will of God for your life. I'd like to exchange the word will with another word that would be used in the same definition as the word, as desire or wish, that you and I can actually know what God's desire is for our life. Don't you want to know that? I mean, I'm like, what's God? What's your desire for my marriage? What's your desire for my next season? What's your desire for my work? What's your desire for my life? I know all of us deep down want to know what that is. And when we know that, it really gives us direction in life, and we don't have to just second guess everything. We could know this is the right thing because this is in the will or the desire of God for my life. Romans chapter 12, verse 1, that speaks to this, and Paul explicitly tells us we can understand the will, says this: therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then, here's what we're talking about. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, and then it describes his will, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. So if you don't have to hear it from me, Paul says it himself that God's will doesn't have to be something elusive to us, but actually can be something that we understand and helps guide our life. And I'll tell you what, when you have the will of God and you know that, you can do everything you do in life with so much more confidence. The 4 things that we need to do, though, that are prerequisites for us to understand what the will of God is, are very important. You can listen to this whole message, you can hear the verses, but if you don't apply these 4 different steps that Paul is going to explain to us, you'll never be able to understand in the way that you could the will of God. These are the steps that we need to take to be able in the right position, the right mindset, the right posture to understand what God's desire is for our life. So if you're taking notes, I tried to, modernize the language of what the points so we can walk away with it more easily. Number 1, write this down. The first thing we need to do to understand the will of God is fill the tank. And no, I'm not talking about your fish tank that looks all moldy at your house. Fill the tank. Let me read the verse again, just so you can hear where I'm pulling this from. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. We cannot go far in life if our tank is not filled. I was with Abel, who was on the stage earlier, and a few months ago, we were coming back from a road trip in Indianapolis. I drove because I didn't trust him. No. And as we drove back from the trip, I wanted to hear one of Abel's messages. He's been preaching, to be able to give him some feedback. And so as we're listening, I'm really getting into it. I'm really tuned in. We're pausing it. We're talking. He's asking questions. And I'm like really tuned in. I'm really not paying attention to what's going on, how fast I'm going, or what's going on in, the car. And Abel says, he kind of, glances over. I don't know if it's because I was speeding or what, but he kind of glances over and says, hey, the gas symbol's coming up over there. We need to go fill it up. Let me tell you, there's two types of people in this world. Two types. There's the people that try to get the E to as close to empty as possible and really like to use the gas tank as a faith-building mechanism, if I'll say it one way or another. It's like you could fill up before work, but why not push it to see if you can really get there? Then there's people like myself, where it's even a fourth of the way close to the E. You start having heart palpitations that you didn't have before. Your blood pressure starts to rise a little bit. Your eyes are bulging because you're nervous. That's what happened instantly with me. And I was like, oh no, Abel, punch it into the GPS. How far away are we? And my heart starts to go, and I start to think of all the worst things. We're right in the middle of nowhere too, we're pushing, and I hope Abel's strong enough to push this thing with me and we can get there. And you start rolling through this. Thankfully, we got to the gas station, which was just a few minutes away. My heart literally did not start beating until I put that into that pump into the car. And my heart was going. And here's what I realized. To get where me and Abel were trying to go, back to our home over here in Chicago, we needed to make sure that our tank was filled with gas. It didn't matter how much we wanted to get back. It didn't matter what the GPS coordinates were. It didn't matter how good I was at driving. If I didn't have gas in the car, I wouldn't be able to get where I wanted to go. Sometimes we as Christians get stuck on the side of the road in our faith journey and have no idea why we're stuck. And I would like to point some of our attention to maybe look at the car signals that it's saying to you, look at the gas odometer that shows that you're on E. Because if you don't have gas, then you don't have the fuel to get to where you're going. Paul is saying to us that Christians have a tank that needs to be filled as well if we want to get to where God's calling us to go. If you don't have this tank filled, you can't live the life that God's calling you to live. If you don't have this tank filled, you will not sacrifice like you would if your tank is filled. It's a little bit like the idea of motivation, how I've heard some people explain this. If you're struggling with the gym, don't wait till 9 p.m. at night to go to the gym. I'm a culprit there. I'll just wait till 9. It's like no one has energy at 9 o'clock at night. But motivation gets renewed every morning. You have motivation to do the hard things that you're going to do, and then it wears over the day. So you need to use it wisely. Well, what Paul is saying here to us in this defining moment in the book of Romans, he's saying the first 11 chapters that I've expressed over and over, the different variables, the different marks of what the gospel is, those things are all important to put into the fuel of your Christian vehicle so that you can now live out what you're called to live out. There are things in our life that as a Christian they're gonna require a lot of us, right? Some things it's like, oh, that's an easy step of obedience. Some things are like, Lord, are you really asking that of me, God? And Paul's saying that when you're a Christian, that you are now a living sacrifice. It's kind of a weird thing to say. No one's ever said that to me. Hey, you're a living sacrifice. But Paul is pulling upon the language that we see in the Old Testament. If you know, the Jews had this, the people of God had this system of sacrifices where they would sacrifice animals to be able to before God. As there was a system of sacrifices. And as they did this, as Jesus came, he did away with the system of sacrifices. He became the ultimate sacrifice. So we don't have to make animal sacrifices to try to, wipe away our sins or try to be right with God in a temporary state. But God says, what Paul's saying is, I want you to see that imagery and still understand that you don't have to sacrifice, cattle or dove, but you do have to view yourself as a living sacrifice. So God didn't ask you to die for him. No, he asked you to live for him. Much more challenging. It's like God didn't say, hey, go just, die for me. If God's called you to be a martyr, then God's called you to be a martyr. But God didn't say, come to me and then die so you can be with me in heaven. He said, no, what's so much harder than just dying for me is living for me. Giving your all for me, day after day, week after week. Offering yourself. Here's what sacrifices are. Sacrifices are offered to God. They're offered to God. And Paul is saying, as a Christian, brothers and sisters, he says, offer yourself to God. Offer yourself to God. Offer your gifts to God. Offer your treasure to God. Offer your talent to God. Offer your job to God. Offer your personality to God. God is saying part of what it means to be a Christian is offering yourself. But here's the key. There are things in our life that when we get to that point, it is very difficult to offer certain things to God. My salvation, I offer you, God. My kid getting healthy, I offer you to God. My well-being, my protection, I offer it to God. Then God goes, what about your sexuality? Ooh. Put that one in my pocket, God. My time, I offer you. God goes, what about your money? Ooh, God, my money, God's like, will you put it on the altar? Ooh. Some of you are like fighting with God. Like, God, you're not tricking out God. You're like, can't get your hand out of your pocket to put your offering. You're unwilling to let it go. And God's saying, you're not willing to offer, but here's the secret. Here's the secret to fill your tank, to let go of anything that's too hard in your life. You know what it is? Paul shows us right here. He says, do it in view of God's mercy. When there is something in your life that is too hard to let go of, God says, take a look at all that I did for you. And you start remembering what God's done for you. You start remembering, the word here in the Greek is not mercy, but mercies. And I want to read to you because he's pointing to all the chapters before. And I want to read, just because maybe you forgot a few of the mercies that we need to remember when our hand becomes closed and we don't want to let go of what we want to offer to God. Listen to what Romans chapter 3, this is one of the mercies. Paul's saying, remember this when it's too hard to let go, that God credits us righteousness apart from works. When it's too hard to let go, remember that God said, you don't have to work for your salvation. It's a gift. You receive it in grace through faith. It's a gift. And it starts opening up your fingers a little bit more. So I don't know, God, it's still hard. I don't know if I want to give that over. God said, are you having a hard time? Paul's saying, you need to make sure you don't forget about this because it will help you to let go. Remember, Romans 4:8, the mercy that our sins are now counted against us. It starts to open up those hands a little bit. I don't know, I still want to hold on to this. God says, will you offer it to me in light of remembering that you don't have a single sin held against you? The enemy can point at you all day. He can try to condemn you all night. People can try to point to old Facebook posts. Hey, look at that, you were all crazy. Hey, some of you guys need to clean up your Facebooks, let me say that, God's saying, I don't care if Facebook remembers it, I don't. You're forgiven of that sin. Romans 6:4, you're not just part of a new religion. That's far inferior to what God's given you. Romans 6:4 says, God gives you new life. New life. That you were brought from spiritual death to spiritual life in Jesus. And it starts to open your hands. Romans 8:1, he frees us from condemnation. Romans 8:17, he makes us children, heirs of God, co-heirs with Christ. Romans 8:28, that God works for our good. When you start hearing those things, you're like, I don't know if I want to let go of that, but you start to remember the mercy that God works it all for your good. It starts to open your hands. So you say, God, I'm going to give you everything I have. Here's my offering, here's my sacrifice, because I do it in light of what you've sacrificed for me. Make sure that when you're struggling with these different things of letting go, that your tank is full with understanding the mercies of God. The Bible says his mercy is new every day, every morning. God has done so much for us. And let me tell you this, if our tank and understanding of what God has done for us is low, then we will not do much for God. But if our tank is filled with all the wonderful, amazing things that our God has done for us, then it is so much easier to live the life that he's called us to, no matter what we have to offer, no matter what we have to sacrifice, because what do we have to offer in comparison with all that he has given? It truly is not even a close comparison, and it helps us live more freely to live out the will that God has called us. Number two, we need to find the peace. And I'm not talking about a gun there. Find the peace. Some of you guys have enough. All right. Verse 1 continues and says, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices. Here's the description of the offering, though. Holy and pleasing. This is your true and proper worship. As he's explaining this, he continues on the idea. We're picking up after connecting these verses, the wholeness of these verses together, is that he continues to talk about this idea of living sacrifices, that we are not our own anymore, but all that we are is giving to God. And now he's starting to describe a little bit this, the ideal offering that God is looking for, that God is not looking for just any offering. He's not looking for you just to offer him anything. Not just anything is acceptable to God. By the way, that was the way it was in the Old Testament. Anytime that there was an animal sacrifice that was brought to God, there was very clear specifications of how the animal was supposed to be brought. Even if you remember in the Passover in Exodus, God says it needs to be a spotless lamb, right? A lamb without blemish, and you should not break the bones of that lamb. Why? Because that lamb was symbolization of Jesus that would come thousands of years later. So God always had clear specifications that you cannot just bring any offering to him. That would not be acceptable. But there needed to be an offering that was set apart. It needed to be different. It needed to be holy and pleasing to him. One of the most dangerous things that we can do in our Christian life is to compartmentalize our Christian walk. You know what I'm talking about. Say, Jesus, I give you this part of me. I give you this day of the week. I give you this, part of my gifting, but I keep the rest to myself. Jesus, you can have that, but this is for me. And I want you to not miss this, because this is important here, that when Paul uses the word body here, he wants us to get the picture that he's talking about not just a part of us, but all of us. That's what he's talking about. He says, offer your body. He's not saying just offer your physical body, but not your mind. He's saying offer all of yourself, all of your being, all of your soul, all of your mind to God as a sacrifice. All that you are, your gifting, your talent, your time, your treasure, your mental capacity, all of that offer to God. It's all God's. And the danger is that we compartmentalize it and say, God, you can have my time, but not my treasure. God, you could have my present, but not my future anxieties. God, you can have my Sunday, and I'll worship you like crazy on Sunday, and I'll love you, and I'll praise so high. But God, you can't have my Friday. Don't go there, Pastor. Don't say it. I'm close to the exit. I'll walk. I'll do it. And we kind of think that, if I check the boxes with God and I kind of do the religious things, I give, I serve, I show up on Sunday, then I'm good with God. We're squared away. We're all good. And God's saying, I'm glad that you go to church, and I'm glad that you give, and I'm glad that you serve, and I'm glad that you listen to Moody Radio. All of those things are good, but I'm not just asking for part of you, I'm asking for all of you. I don't just want your religious acts, I want your heart. I went on a trip a few years back with my wife, and I told my wife that we would go to the jacuzzi. We were in Florida, And, we had a jacuzzi in the middle of all these apartment buildings, and my wife had told me, okay, we're gonna go. And I kept pushing it off. Yeah, well, tomorrow, we'll do it tomorrow. Well, this day, she kind of cornered me. She said, we're going to the jacuzzi, right? I'm like, we're going to the jacuzzi, we'll do it. So she tells me, we end up going out to dinner, and as we come back, it's like 10 o'clock at night. I don't wanna go in the jacuzzi at 10 o'clock at night. And she goes, hey, do you wanna go in the jacuzzi? And I'm like, babe, like, it's 10, it's kinda late. I'm not like, and she's like, but you told me you would. And I'm like, okay, right, all right, let's do it. Like, let's go to the jacuzzi, let's do it. She goes, nope, I'm okay. No, actually, I don't wanna go to the jacuzzi anymore. Now I know I messed up, right? I'm like, no, babe, I'm putting my trunks on, I wanna go. Like, I love the jacuzzi. I can't wait for the bubbles and the little human particles in the middle of it. Like, let's go. And she's like, no, like, like, I'm good. Then she goes to her room, our room, but her room because the door closed, right? And she goes to her room and she closes the door, and I knew I messed up. So I give her some time, and then I go into the room and I say, hey, Carolina, I'm sorry about the jacuzzi thing. I still want to go in. When you're digging yourself out, right? I always loved the jacuzzi growing up. And I'm doing it, and I said, I'll go. I said, I'll go. I'll do it. And this is what she told me. I'll never forget this. I'll never forget what she told me. I'm like, I'll go to the jacuzzi. I'll do it. She says, and that's the problem. She's like, that's the problem. She says, you'll go because you know it's the right thing, but you don't want to go and have your heart fully in it. She said, I don't want you to just go. I want you to want to go. And I'm like, that's crazy. I don't want to go. Sometimes you just got to do things as a husband that you don't want to do. Like, I don't always want to do the dishes, but I do it. But I don't want to go, but I will go. I'll do my duty. And she's like, she was like, that's the problem. I don't want you to just, hear me again, I don't want you to just do the right thing. I don't want you to just go and check the box. I want your heart in it. I want you to go because you want to spend time with me. What was she saying? What was she saying? Don't check the box. Don't just do it because you know it's the right thing. Do it because you want to do it. Do it because your heart's in it. And God says the same thing. Jesus echoes in Matthew what Hosea said in chapter 6. In Hosea, God was dealing with his people with the exact same thing. They were offering the sacrifices, the animal sacrifices, and yet their hearts were not in it. They were living with idols. They were sleeping around. They were, messing around with foreign nations that weren't God's nation. They were doing their own thing, and yet they were still trying to check off the box and do the right thing. And so Jesus echoes this when he sees the Pharisees who had the same heart. And they do their tithes, they're praying out in public so other people can see them. They're fasting and they let everybody see it so people can see how holy I am. And Jesus is sitting with sinners, tax collectors, the lowest of his day, people that the Pharisees would never be seen around. And they start talking to Jesus' disciples saying, yo, what's your guy doing? Like, this is your teacher, your rabbi, and he's sitting with those people? And this is where Jesus talks about his famous thing, I didn't come for the healthy, I came for the sick, right? A doctor comes for those that are sick. And then he says this, he echoes Hosea to speak to what the heart of the Israelites had to deal with, and God dealt with them, and the heart of all we have to deal with. He said, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. He says, what is he saying there? The better translation of mercy is love. What is he saying? I desire your heart, not just you going to church. I desire you, all of you, not just you giving your money. I desire all that you are, not just you reading your Bible in the morning for 15 minutes and checking a box. If that's all that you're willing to give me, you're not truly following me. I've asked for you to give me all of yourself as a living sacrifice. I gave all of myself on the cross, so don't compartmentalize yourself to me. It all matters to God. The big things and the small things. My wife and I I was in charge with watching our son and blew it the other day. And my wife had given me clear instructions, as she always does when she leaves, about, by the way, she's in the back right there, because I'm talking about her so much. Come on in the back. Love of my life. Hey, we got 2 babies coming, all right? We got one baby coming. Sorry, one. We got one baby coming and one this, so it's going good. It's going good. And she let me, I was watching the baby the other day, and she gave me all these instructions to put the food on Saint's little, that's my son's name, on his counter. And I made a big blunder. I left his glass container with the fruit on his little, tray. Ugh. He finished eating, and this dude goes, I almost felt like he looked at me. He goes, this thing shattered all over the place. I mean, we don't have a huge condo, but this thing just exploded like a bomb. And I was cleaning up for 30 minutes. I have friends coming over, I was cleaning, because I don't want this kid to have glass. It's easy to get those big pieces, right? You pick them up, you grab them, it's easy to get those. But the small pieces, there's where it gets tricky, because we have carpet too. And so, yeah, look, I'm just bringing you in on my pain. So my wife found 2 pieces after vehemently cleaning this thing. And so last night after our son goes to bed, we're taking the carpet and we're cleaning it as much as we can, because here's what we realize. The big pieces are easier to pick up, but they can hurt you. The small pieces that are harder to pick up can hurt you just as much. The big things matter and the small things matter. So we spent an hour looking, or 30 minutes, whatever, looking all with light in the dark, trying to find every piece of glass, because we know that even the smallest piece of glass makes a difference. God combs through our life with the power of the Holy Spirit. And sometimes our understanding is that, God, you're good with me because I'm not drinking, I'm not clubbing, I'm not sleeping around, and we kind of feel like we've checked the big boxes, we must be pretty good. And God is saying, I know those big things can be hurtful to your life, like big pieces of glass, but those little things, some of them that you're aware of them, some of that you're not. Those little things that are hidden in your life, in the cracks of your life. Those little things that have to deal with things like your motive, your gossip, your speech, how you treat people when no one else is looking, that little white lie, that thing you do in private that nobody knows. Those little things, God says, those are what matter to me as well. Because remember, he's not just asking you to have the big pieces of your life in order. No, he's saying, I want all of you. All of you. So the big things and the small things matter to me. Why? Because I want you to be holy and pleasing, right? It's that type of sacrifice, one that's set apart, but one that's saying, God, is my life pleasing to you? And the more that you walk with Jesus, I walk with Jesus for some time, there's not moments in my life where I'm like, oh, there's not areas to work on. The more I walk with God, the more he keeps pointing with that flashlight of the Holy Spirit and says, Josiah, this little thing right here. I'm like, oh God. He's like, you see this? Come close. See that right there? I'm like, but God, that's small. God, no one knows about it. God, is that really affecting me and you? It's so small. I mean, I'm not snorting lines of cocaine. I'm not out here sleeping. I'm not cheating on my wife. God goes, I don't care if you're not. This matters too. And that little bit of cancer can become something overwhelming in your life. That little bit of poison can become something toxic in your life. That little bit of sin can be something that overwhelms your life and really takes you to a place that you never thought it would take you. So God is saying, find the peace. It matters to me. Find the peace. Well, it's just a little piece. Yeah, that little piece of glass matters to my son's throat and my foot at 2 a.m. in the morning. Find the peace. Is there any pieces in your life that you need to submit and offer to God up on the altar and say, God, I want to hear your will. I want to know what you have, what your desire is for my life. And those little things matter for me living with you. I want to find the peace. Number three, fight the squeeze. And I'm not talking about your squeeze next to you. He says in verse 2, he says this, do not conform to the pattern of this world. These are very famous verses. Our English translation does a great job with them. Conform and transform in the next verse. Go great together. It's easy to remember. Many people say these verses. But I want to be clear that as you're trying to live the right way for God, it's a battle. I always think about this. It would be a lot easier if God said, Josiah, once you're a Christian, you go join all the other Christians in the mountains of Montana. You leave all these sinful people behind over here, all the chaos of this modern world, and you guys all just wear a certain color robe and all, just stay away from all the moral filth. Hey, that may be easier to try to practice our faith. There may be a little bit less temptation. There may be a little bit less negative influence from the outside. But you know what? We would also lose our influence to reach people for Christ. God hasn't called us to follow him and then run away from the darkness of the world. No, he's called us to be what? The light in the darkness. That the more dark our city gets, the more dark our world gets, the brighter our light shines. And the more that we live for Jesus, that brighter that light can be shown to our neighbors and coworkers and family. That's why God hasn't called us to go and depart to mountains or to vacant farmland. He's called us to be light in the middle of the darkness. But we also need to be aware that as we are influencers, we are also being influenced. There are a lot of things pulling you to conform to the ways of this world. Pulling you to conform to the ideals of success of this world. Pulling you to conform your views about sexuality or cohabitation to the standard of the world standard and not to the standard of God's standard. Calling you to conform to the same work ethic style at your job as everybody else around you that doesn't know Jesus, because man, that's a tough boss and corporate doesn't treat you right. I remember working in a warehouse when I was a college student. And I remember being in that environment with people, some people that weren't serious about their job, smiling to the boss, and then when he turned, sneering at him and making jokes about him, trying to take any break they could on the clock, time theft. And I remember not feeling holier than thou, like, oh, I'm better than these people. I remember feeling like the influence of that atmosphere, the influence of, well, why should I really bust my butt if everyone's being lazy and going to sleep in the back room? Well, why should I really put my heart and soul and care about the little corners of this shop if these guys aren't doing their jobs correctly? And what was I feeling? I was feeling the pressure of an environment that was trying to shape me to conform. Hey, you don't need to work too hard. We just kind of do what we do at this pace. Well, I felt like, no, my motivation is not be conformed to the way that the world's doing it, but to be transformed. I don't want to work like everybody else is working. I want to work like I'm working for Jesus. I remember being in high school, and when I was in high school, one of my buddies that had just started dating was at the like, women, are you really a man? Are you really? They started questioning him. What we call that is peer pressure. Why? Because, hey, you're not doing what we expect of you to do. If you're living in purity, there must be something wrong with you. If you're not doing it like we're all doing it, then there must be something off about you. But they don't understand. We've changed. We're not the same person. So I don't have to feel, I can push back against that pressure of the world. You need to sleep before you get married. You got to test before you drive. If you're going to go, I just have one drink. You got to enjoy yourself. You work hard. And we're pushing back against the pressure because I'm telling you, it's trying to mold you to look like everybody else. Everybody else's relationship, everybody else's work ethic, everybody else's perspective about the long-term future. They're trying to force you and mold you, and it's just the way that the system of the world works. Paul's saying, If you're not aware of it, you won't fight back. If you're not aware, you won't resist. But I want you to be aware that this is not the culture. This is not the manner of thinking. This is not the way that God's called you to live. This is not the way that God has called you to take care of your body or to treat other people. Hey, the world, in certain places of the world and in many communities around us, it's okay to treat people less than because of the skin color they look like. Historically, that was like, well, that's just kind of what they're just not fully a human being. That's just what they are. You could talk about Rwanda. You could talk about the Nazis. You could talk about blacks in America historically in slavery. But the word of God then and now says the same thing. Yeah, that may be the way the world treats somebody else, but that's not the way that God sees them and then not the way that we should treat them, right? Historically, there's historically, even in Nazi Germany, there was the extermination of disabled people, eugenics, cleaning out the DNA, the bloodlines, basically, purifying it. And so people that had any disabilities were viewed as, oh, those are people that are less than. But it was the Christians that stood up. It was the Christians that pushed back. It was the Christians that fought. Why? Why? Because we said, hey, we know that the world's thinking is not always right, so we go back to the Bible because we do not want to be conformed to the way that the world thinks. We want to know, what do you have to say, God? So fight the squeeze. Every single person in here, whether you're a new believer, you've been a believer for a long time, will feel the squeeze of the world trying to make you a copy of everybody else. And let me say this, as a Christian, in love because I care about you, if you look at your life and you see that your version of your life in purity and morality and righteousness is the word that the Bible uses, is not that different than someone that doesn't know Jesus, if it looks pretty similar, almost like a copy, then you may be living the pattern or the mold of the world. The good news is it's not too late, right? We can still break out of that mold. Listen to the final point. Feed the mind. Feed the mind. Paul says, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what his good will is, what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. New thinking leads to new living. That's the reality. And what Paul is saying here clearly is that it is a process to renew our mind. It doesn't happen just by default. Like, because you become a Christian doesn't mean that you now have just this mind that doesn't have any of the old ways of thinking, any of the old challenges. No, just you're a new creation. You are washed of your sins. You have new life in Jesus, but we still have to work through the old ways of thinking. When I became a father, a few months after I became a father, it was Father's Day, and it was new to me. And I remember having a conversation with my mom, and I told her, I said, hey, Mom, what are we going to do for Dad for Father's Day? Are we going to go to a restaurant? Which restaurant are we going to go to? And she stopped me, and she said, wait, hold up. She said, do you mean, what are we going to do for both of you guys? She said, you're a father, Josiah, remember. And I was like, yeah, I forget. I know because I'm not sleeping because my son doesn't sleep. But I said, I know that I realize that I'm a father, but it's kind of like that title, that new status, all of that hasn't fully ingrained yet. I'm still wrestling with kind of that being my reality and affecting my actions. And even though my status was updated, hear me clearly, even though my status was updated, my thinking was outdated. Still outdated. My thinking had to catch up to where I was now. My position had changed, my title had changed, my standing had changed, but my thinking was still lagging behind. And so there was a process that I needed to do to make sure that my thinking would catch up to where I actually was standing, my new position, my new reality. It's the same thing in our faith. You're a Christian, you're washed by the blood, you're a son or daughter of God, you have new access You have new access through Jesus, but sometimes our thinking has not caught up yet to the reality of what God says about us. I finished this book on my trip called Soundtracks by this guy named John Acuff, and he said, if you don't control your thoughts will control you. And he says, all of us have soundtracks that are playing, and you need to identify those soundtracks and replace those soundtracks. And this is a guy who was speaking right to the reality of what the Bible has to say. That a lot of us have tracks in our mind saying, you're still nobody, you're still a loser, you're still a sinner, you cannot be used, you don't have any gifting, you're not valid, and we have all these soundtracks that are playing that is not the way that God views us. It's not our reality, but it hasn't caught up to where we are actually, our new position, our new title. And so when somebody says, hey, do you want to be used by God? We have a position for you to serve. You want to come out, help out with the food pantry. You still have this track that's playing that, well, my parent always told me, or I always believed I was a nobody. I'm still, just condemned. And even though you're a new creation, you still have the same old way of thinking. And it's holding you back from being who God already calls you to be. What are the soundtracks? What are the thoughts? What are the thinking that when new opportunities arrive, when new things happen in your life, when God asks you to do something, what is the fears that start to play in your mind? The insecurities, the no's that you give yourself before you ever ask. Well, I'm not gonna ask him because they're probably gonna say no. You didn't even ask. But you have a soundtrack going in your mind already that are lies that we need to replace with what? The truth of God. And that's why Paul says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. How do we do that? Feed the mind. Feed the mind. My dad always tells me when I'm talking to someone, he says, what's the voice they're listening to? Who are they listening to? Who are you listening to that is conforming you either to be more like Jesus or more like the world? What do you listen to on YouTube? What do you listen to? What do you watch on streaming services? What do you listen to on Spotify or podcasts where you listen to podcasts? What music do you listen to? Who do you hang around with? What are the voices that you're hearing and what are the voices that you're believing? This is important because God is saying, I want to replace those old ways of thinking and I want you to be transformed. And if you can control the way that you think, you will control the way that you live. If you can believe what God has to say about you and not what your parents said or your community said or you say about yourself, you will live a completely different life. So as a man thinks, they will live. And when we do this, when we feed our mind by listening to the word, by being around other believers, by meditating on the word, by praying, when we are renewing our mind with all of these things, by practicing Thanksgiving, one of the most powerful ways is simply just to get in the word. I read a lot of books, I listen to a lot of podcasts, but I always go back to the word because I want to know what God has to say and where he has to direct my life. And you may not understand everything God always says. You may not understand every soundtrack that's in your head. You may wrestle with the different things that God has asked you to offer. But let me tell you this. Here's what the word says. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. As you trust in the Lord, as you apply these 4 steps, you stop conforming, you start renewing, you start giving yourself fully to God, you start realizing the mercies that fuel everything that we do. Let me tell you this, you start to live the will of God in your life, and you start to understand the will of God in your life. Sometimes here at the church, and I finish with this, sometimes here at the church, where my dad is very present still, I'll be in a leadership discussion and my dad won't be there. And people will say, one of the leaders will say, hey, well, why don't you reach out to your dad? And I'm always reaching out to him. But sometimes I'll say, I actually know what he would say already in this. Can I tell you why I know that? It's not because I can read my dad's brain, but it's because the fact that I've been around my dad so much and listened to him so much, and I know his voice, that I know my dad's mind and I know his heart. I know what pleases him and I know what doesn't please him. I know what he would do and I know what he wouldn't do. I know that if somebody said, here's what your dad wants you to do, and I know my dad, I can say, I absolutely know that my dad would never ask me to do that. And if somebody says, here, your dad said to do that, I said, I absolutely know that that is something my dad would ask me to do. And so as I know my dad's heart and mind, I'm able to know what his desire for my life is. When you know the mind and heart of God that you can only know through a relationship with Jesus, and as you fully offer yourself to God, God starts to let you in on the secret of saying, this is my heart for you. This is my desire for your life. Sometimes that's general and sometimes that's specific, but you will never fully know what the will of God is for your life until you fully commit yourself to him.